We can do questions at the end.
Okay. But yeah, I'm pretty flexible. Anyhow, what I want to do is talk a little bit about how you build civic action campaigns, especially in the context of organizing in Scarborough, and just use the Save the Grace campaign as an example of that. It's got a lot of features that go into how to structure a campaign like this. Plus, I had a lot of pictures from that campaign, so I made it for a good PowerPoint. And the first thing you want to know with every campaign, and it's no exception with this one, but it's absolutely universal to civic action campaigning, is you got to know what's the outcome that you really want. Where do you really want to get to? And I know that it sounds incredibly simple and really, really basic, but I can't count the number of campaigns I've been involved with where they don't really actually know what it is that counts as a win, when they will have accomplished their objective. They want to raise consciousness or make the world better, or open up this issue. And those are all things that are, it's really hard to tell if you've succeeded at that. And if it's hard to tell if you've succeeded at it, it's really hard to plan to get there. And to map out a route to a place that you haven't defined terribly well. So first thing in all civic campaigns is to say, what's a win for us? What do we want to accomplish? And in this particular case, we wanted to save the Grace Hospital. We wanted to make sure that the Birchmount site of the Scarborough Health Network didn't close down. And that was a little bit tricky because, in fact, that campaign had already been successful. And in fact, been successful a couple of times because they'd tried to close it a couple of times. And one of the things that the folks who are behind this situation had learned is if you walk into a room and say, hey, I'm going to close your hospital, things don't go very well. So they took a very different route. They didn't go for a direct closure of the hospital. They were proposing a more indirect strategy by which they would close the pediatrics and obstetrics programs. If you do that, then among the things that stops happening is pregnant women and people with little kids stop going to that emergency room because you can't be admitted there. And so if you go to the emergency room and you're really, really sick, they have to put you in an ambulance or on a bus or something and move you to someplace else. And it doesn't take very long for people to figure out, I'm not going to that emerge. And once they stop going to the emerge, the hospital starves out. The hospital doesn't get enough clients, and then it starts to close all on its own. In fact, the closure becomes inevitable because people stop going there, and then they say, well, why do we have this whole site that nobody goes to? And that's been a pattern for lots of hospitals across Ontario. So we knew that we were fighting on one front to try and get success on another front, and that was a little bit challenging. But the fundamental goal was, how do we save the Grace? And part of that was by making sure that they don't move these two programs. The second thing that everybody needs to know about a civic action campaign, and for the most part people don't know, is who is it that you actually want to move? Who is it that can give you the thing that you want? And it doesn't really matter if Donald Trump decided that he was supportive of saving the Grace, and Justin Trudeau decided that he was supportive of saving the Grace. That didn't get us anything, because neither of them is in the process of closing the Grace. And so we had to figure out whose mind do we need to change to save this hospital. And in this case, there were a few potential targets. You could start with the hospital administration. They were the ones proposing the closure, and those two women at the top were making the case for closing obstetrics and pediatrics, and they both knew full well that if they succeeded in that, the hospital would starve and its closure would be inevitable. And we could go after them. The problem was that they had dug into this really deep. They had built this campaign, they had made these plans, they had been, I would have to say, not entirely forthright with the community or their own staff or other people about what they were doing. And so trying to move somebody who's dug in that deep is usually pretty hard. And so they didn't seem like great candidates. So the next question was, well, who's above them or has control over them or can guide them to do the right thing? And the logical next candidate was the Local Health Integration Network. Why don't we go to them? That's where people had gone the time before to try and stop closing the Grace and have been very successful. It was a really good idea, except that the woman in the lower left-hand corner had canceled all the LHINs right about the time that we were having this conversation, so they weren't there to go to. So then what about herself? What about the Minister of Health? Why don't we look at the Minister of Health and see if we can persuade her to step in and say, nope, closing the grace is a bad idea. The problem was that she also was going to be a very hard target to move. First of all, she was going to get most of her information from the very people on the top of the screen that were advocating for this, and the people in the ministry who had been advocating for this for a long time. And second of all, and this was a rather awkward component, and we'll come back to this soon, she had a pretty strong tie to the lobbyists that got hired by those two women at the top of the screen. So it was going to be difficult at the staff level to move her along. And so there were some real problems with trying to move her. And so that kind of left us with only one candidate. There was only really one person in the province of Ontario who hadn't already dug in on this, who had the power to make this happen, who didn't have a particular commitment to people or causes that were going to prevent us from winning this campaign. And that was the Premier, Doug Ford. And so he became our target. It became pretty clear that though he was a tough target to get, he was the guy we had to go for. So we settled on going after the Premier. Now, the Premier is not an easy one to get because he's busy, he's pretty heavily insulated, and in all fairness, deciding which hospitals close and which ones don't is not something premiers normally get directly involved in, and there's a reason for that, which is that they don't want to be wearing every hospital closure, so they try and stay away from them. So this was going to be challenging, getting Doug to step in on this file. So how do we get this on his desk, even though he doesn't want it there? And there's a few elements that we recognized we needed to get this in front of Doug and make sure that Doug felt like it was his job to make this decision. And we knew that that wasn't going to be easy, but we knew that that's where we needed to be to win. One of the things we had to do is eliminate a bunch of roadblocks. There's a bunch of reasons not to put this on his desk, and we wanted to make sure that all of those were taken off the table, that regardless of how legitimately he didn't want to have this file, there was no way to keep it off his desk. And so we had to eliminate all the excuses he might have for saying, hang on a second, this is not the job of the Premier of Ontario. Secondly, we had to make him interested in it, because it's not enough just to get this in front of him. He has to decide that this is worth his attention and focus on it. And we knew the minister wasn't going to help us, and the hospital administration were going to help us with that. So we needed to come up with a strategy that pushed this in front of Doug in a whole bunch of ways that he just couldn't ignore. And lastly, and most importantly, whoever is your target, your job is to persuade them to do something. And you can only persuade somebody to do something by talking to them in the language that they can hear. If you try and bully or harangue somebody into doing something, you better have a lot of power over that person, because bullying and haranguing are usually not things that people want to listen to, and so they tend to try to tune it out. So we had to figure out, how do we get Doug interested in this in a way that he can hear that this matters to him in terms of the things that he already cares about. Because the easiest way to get somebody to do something is to persuade them that this is the kind of thing that they would normally want to do, and they just hadn't thought of it yet. So that was our thinking, is how do we get this onto the Premier's desk, get around all the roadblocks, and talk to him in language that he can hear and can't ignore. So that was going to take a lot, and a lot of work got done. So eliminating the roadblocks was one of the first things. So what happens when you try to take something off of a minister's desk and put it on a Premier's desk is the first thing they're going to say is, wait a minute, that's somebody else's job. Take it back there. Take it back to the Minister of Health. So though we knew we could not win with the Minister of Health, we spent a lot of time with her. Allura and all the doctors and other people from the local neighborhood associations met with her in her office with her staff, and we took a nice selfie with her and tweeted it all over the world and talked about how supportive she sounded when she did all that. And we chased her and chased her and chased her because we needed to eliminate that excuse that the Premier could use to say, oh, wait a minute, no, that's the health minister's job, take it back there. We needed to use up that route. And so we met with the minister repeatedly, we chased her, and we tracked and communicated all of that. We tweeted it and sent letters about it and recorded it in every way we could so that the Premier could see that we'd done that job. And we tracked very carefully the clear indications that she was not going to be able to act. And those indications came in a bunch of forms. That picture in the middle is the health minister with her chief of staff, the woman on the right, and in between is Jamie Watt, who was the lobbyist for the hospital and the father of the chief of staff of the health minister. And that was a pretty close nexus, and we knew that was going to be a problem. And so we kept raising that issue, like, can she really act? Can she really be independent? She's a little too tied in with their lobbyist. Their lobbyist got hired without even due process. They're paying them thousands and thousands of dollars, and they didn't even RFP this thing properly. Something's not right here. All of that was stuff that we got in front of the premier to help him feel like, oh, you know what, I can't really send them back to the health minister because that's going to be a problem. Not that that was going to change anything dramatically, but it was going to close off that excuse and help us stay on the premier's desk. And she sent letters. Oops, sorry. Go back up. There we go. She sent letters promising the moon, sun, the moon, and the stars, and then didn't act on any of them. And we recorded those and flagged those and got those in front of the premier as well. So we did our fair share of the work of focusing on the Ministry of Health to an extent that the premier could accept that we'd done that job, and he couldn't legitimately say, oh, wait a minute, you haven't done this yet, go down there. So we took care of that. Then we really had to be on the premier's radar. And getting on the premier's radar was going to take a lot, and we did a whole heck of a lot. We needed a bunch of different simultaneous strategies, and we applied a bunch of them. We had a media strategy to try and make sure that there was enough buzz, that the premier thought this was worth his while. And we did all kinds of things to interest the media, including demonstrations, to get earned media. So we got folks on TV talking about how terrible this was. We bought ads in the Scarborough Mirror, urging Doug to step in and do the right thing, because we wanted to make sure we were talking to him in language he could understand. And we recognized that Scarborough is a big, diverse place, especially North Scarborough is a big, diverse place. And so we couldn't just reach out to the Scarborough Mirror. We had to be visible in other kinds of media as well. And so we bought ads in the Tamil newspapers. We reached out to Tamil TV and Tamil radio at the Tamil festivals, and they talked about this. So we tried to get on the radar and create as much buzz through media as we could, and that was part of what motivated the premier to pay attention to this. And we got petitions from everywhere, and they all got sent to Doug. We had online petitions, and we had local elected officials doing petitions. Iris Babikian did his petition, and Jim Karagianis did a separate petition. And we had our own separate online petition, and the nurses had an online petition. And we went to all kinds of events, and all through the summer festivals, and all the, we went to Tamil Fest, and we went to the pujas, and we went to all kinds of things to try and get people to sign up. And we had people signing thousands of pieces of paper that they punched into online petitions and mailed it into the premier, again, to make him feel like, oh, there's this groundswell of stuff, I can't really ignore this. And we got directly in front of the premier as well. Direct engagement with the premier was part of the package. So we had these little cutout things that Allura made in her garage, where you could hold a little frame around your head and take a picture with a message for the premier and tweet it to his phone. And we tweeted dozens and dozens of pictures with messages from people in Scarborough at the premier to try and get him to recognize that this was a problem. And again, tried to stick with messages that he could hear. So this doesn't say, Doug Ford, you suck, you're wrecking my hospital. It says, we deserve equal treatment in Scarborough, because that's something Doug Ford has said, and we wanted to underscore that. And we showed up at Ford Fest, and we went around and talked to the MPPs, and we got on this in the selfie line with Doug, and Allura's poor children had to stand in line for like 4 hours and to finally talk to Doug Ford, which they weren't too excited about. And of course, we arrived at his events and spoke directly to him. And this is one of my favorite pieces. I'm just going to play a tiny little bit of video. And this comes with a pop quiz, but
so we're going to keep the pediatric sections open then? They're all going to be open?
I'm just going to play that again because that's, oh, sorry. Because that's Doug telling us.
So we're going to keep the pediatric sections open then? They're all going to be open?
Absolutely, because Doug likes to please people. And if you get him in a spot and say, are you going to stand up for Scarborough? He can't resist saying yes. And so here's the pop quiz. Who's the off-screen voice? Oh, you're muted.
Allura.
Nope. That's
Allura.
Down there with a hat. Any other guesses?
I know.
Yeah, you know. Ready?
So we're going to keep the pediatrics and obstetrics open then? They're all going to be open?
Anna, maybe?
Anna.
It's Anna. Anna's standing
Oh.
just to the left of the premier. Anna's standing there, and she popped. We were all asking him this question, and that she was the one that he listened to and answered, and he said, "Absolutely, I'm going to keep the pediatrics and obstetrics." So we were getting, yeah, we were getting in front of him in every way we could, so that he could not ignore that this was a problem. It wasn't going away. It was finding its way to him, and as much as he would rather push it off to somebody else, he really couldn't. This was before him, and he was going to have to make a call.
So we're going to keep the
But we couldn't do that all by ourselves. There were a bunch of people who were really active in the campaign, and they were great people. But you need, you need a big, substantial presence if you want to move a premier. And there was big, substantial presence and a big network that was involved. So we built a really good base. The neighborhood associations were a key part of that, and they were some of the key movers in this. And that was one of the things that gave it not only a lot of scope and a lot of people and a lot of presence, but a lot of credibility. Elected officials, they don't mind annoying people like me. I'm an organizer, and I'm in their face all the time, and they're used to it, and they don't care. They really mind annoying the folks who are the backbone of their communities, and neighborhood associations are great examples of that. And community groups are great examples of that. And there are lots of community groups that got involved. And there were a lot of health professionals and local elected officials and other people who got involved in the scope of that campaign that we were able to demonstrate was out there to the premier, was really important. The cultural diversity, the geographic diversity across North Scarborough of people who were concerned about this, and into South Markham. That was also important to the premier. And so we needed to show that there are a lot of allies, and we need to get those allies excited and engaged in that process. We wouldn't have got thousands of petitions in front of the premier if we didn't have those networks to reach out to and through, to be able to make sure that we were present in a bigger world, and to give credibility to the campaign, because now all kinds of groups were getting on board. And they were all worried about declining healthcare care in their communities. So it was that we had a message that would mean something to those networks that we wanted to reach out to. And of course, we reached out through other kinds of allies. We reached out to a lot of MPPs. We reached out to a lot of community leaders. We reached out to city councilors. We reached out to healthcare leaders. That's Ruben Devlin, the premier's healthcare guru, in the upper right-hand corner. You probably recognize the various MPPs from around and in North Scarborough. We reached out to every MPP who touches North Scarborough, even remotely, to make sure that they knew that we were concerned. And they responded very positively and conveyed their concerns to the premier. And we had to deliver a message that was really clear. If we said, obstetrics and pediatrics, they're really important to people, and we'd really like to make sure that they stay, and they're a big part of our community, that wasn't going to work very well. We needed a really clear, simple message that the premier would look at and say, damn, that is A, something I can't ignore, and B, something the people I'm counting on will hear and worry about. So we reached out to the premier and said, only you can save us. We need a fair deal for North Scarborough, language that he's always used. That's why we're getting a subway in Scarborough, is because Scarborough deserves the same kind of treatment as the rest of the city. People will die, so this is not a one-time problem. If you let this go on, there will be bad things that pile up in the course of the future, and a very simple cut line: save the grace. We had buttons, and we had stickers, and we had tweets, and we had banners, and we had signs, and we had fold-up signs people could hold up at the AGMs for the hospital that said, just save the grace. And I didn't include the picture of the tiny little baby that had just been born at the grace that came out to that barbecue on the left, holding up a tiny little save the grace sign, but that's also very cute. Those kinds of messages were compelling and simple and clear, and that meant that we had the other key ingredient. We knew who we were going after. It had to be the premier. There was no one else that would actually pull this problem out of the fire. We knew that we couldn't get it alone, so we had to build a base that was big and broad and engaged and participatory. We knew we had to close off his escape route by proving that the minister couldn't do it, and we needed to confront him in every way we possibly could to make this compelling to him. And then we needed to reinforce that in a way that meant that he could not walk away from it. And part of that was just politics. So you can see at the top, Dolly Begum and Andrea Horvath, who both, the leader of the opposition and the member of the opposition caucus from Scarborough, both wrote to the premier and said this was a disaster and called on him to step in. MPPs from even outside of Scarborough who had problems with the hospitals, like Roman Baber, who's in the middle there, joined into this because they knew that they had problems, and if we could solve this problem, we might be able to solve their problem. And they leaned on him. The Tory MPPs had a little caucus revolt. They picked on the Premier's chief of staff a whole bunch. They picked on the Premier a whole bunch. They all got pulled in a room together and said, this is a real problem. We're going to lose our seats. And that's not going to be good for you, and it's not going to be good for us. It's not going to be good for being able to keep this government in the long run. And the federal election was coming up, and we thought, okay, what if we polled on this and tried to put some emphasis on how much people don't really like the closure of the hospital. And we thought about that a bit and thought, well, that's not really news. That doesn't change much. Everybody knows that nobody likes hospital closures, but this is a federal election. It's a provincial matter, so that's not going to be a big issue. And we were pretty sure it would be. We were pretty sure that we asked people, if the Tories in Ontario close your hospital, and then the Tories from Ottawa come to town and ask for your vote, how are you going to take that? And so we polled on it, and the poll was really, really strong that Andrew Scheer was going to pay a price if Doug Ford let this hospital close. And then we got that poll and we got it out to all kinds of folks. We got it out to the Conservative Party leadership, and we got it out to the media, and we got it out to the Premier's office, and we got it out to the MPs who were running for the Conservatives, and we got it out to the MPs who were running for the Liberals, who were trying to hold on to their seats, to say, see, being on side with us is good for you. We got good response from the MPs that were seeking re-election, all of whom were Liberals, and all of whom could point across the floor at the other guy and say, see, these are the guys who are going to, let your hospital close. And that was the kind of message that made it something that he absolutely could not ignore. And he didn't ignore it. In the end, he had to put this on his desk, and he did. And he sat at his desk, and he went back and forth, and he texted, with the caucus members who were revolting, and he sat them all down and talked to them. And his chief of staff got them all in a room and talked them through stuff. And he intervened with the minister and said, you're going to have to demonstrate to me that this makes sense. And he reached out to some of the key members of our team, some of the docs on our team, and he phoned them up directly to say, I understand that this is an issue. I'm dealing with it. I'm going to make sure this is okay. As he did in the rest of that video clip, kept saying, I'm going to save your hospital. It's going to be all right. I'm going to be there for you. And he hauled in the minister and made her justify her decision. And that intense counterpush by us required them to step up a whole bunch. And so in the end, we did not win. We did not get them to keep the pediatrics and obstetrics at the Grace. They moved those two programs, but what we did do is we put them in a position where they had to do a bunch of stuff that makes their long-term objective a whole lot harder. They had to spend a whole bunch of money building a bigger ER. It's going to be a lot harder to hold a hospital, close a hospital that you just spent a lot of money fixing up. They made a bunch of commitments, both all of them in writing, both that they would never close the Grace until they had another North Scarborough site in place, that they would never close the Grace, period, and that this wasn't about closure. They promised the Premier up and down that this was not going to turn into a fiasco in North Scarborough, and that they had this managed. And they've put themselves in a position that even if with the pediatrics and obstetrics gone, you see a decline in that ER. They're going to be in a tough position to say, oh, we had no idea this was coming, but now that we look at it, this hospital doesn't work and we're going to have to close it. They've really hung themselves out there. And so while we didn't get them not to move peds and OB, we did put them in a very, very bad position for their long-term goal, and gave ourselves new tools and new equipment to be able to fight them later on about our main objective, which is still keeping that site open so that people can use it in North Scarborough. So that was the